one.
Welcome to Senate Education 323 on Wednesday, April 20th. We're going to start by looking at H716. We have our alleged counsel, Beth St. James, with us. How are you, Ms. St. James?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. So, Ms. St. James, H716, you have a new draft with before us. I will pass it out to
all the good committee members.
All the good committee members. Senator Tiranzini, it's online. This is a new draft, H716. Ms. St. James, I would like to remove this section before you take us through it. You and I talked about this as a possibility, the delay in section 2. And I'd like to attach it to H101. That will give our committee a little more time. It's been an interesting conversation. You know, I think we all keep going back and forth, delay, don't delay. And it'll give us a little more time next week because I'd like this bill to leave tomorrow or Friday, and then we get a little bit more extra time on it.
Sure.
Draft 5, just to confirm, draft 5.1 we're looking at?
That is correct.
Thank you.
So, Ms. St. James, would you mind taking us through it?
Sure. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. Do you want me to, there's really nothing new that you haven't seen yet in here. What would you like to look at specifically?
So maybe just go, I think it's worth, given that we've had a lot of different things in the air, a lot of different conversations, just walk us through it again. Tell us what each section, starting with the census grant, telling us again why we're doing that, or reminding us we've got the Holocaust education report and recommendations, which I'm not sure if we've seen this new language without civic education in, perhaps we have. The bond language, and then the educator workforce development.
Sure. So section 1 of your strike all amendment to H716 came over in the version of H716 that passed the House. And it is an amendment to 16 VSA 2961, which is the special education funding statute, specifically the census grant. So Act 173 changed how special education is calculated. And what you had before you, 2961, the census grant goes into effect on July 1, 2022, so in a couple months. And that's a result of Act 173. Prior to this going into effect, so today, special education funding is delivered through a mainstream block grant. So what section 1 does is this new census grant model provides a built-in transition to get supervisory unions from the first year of the change, which will be fiscal year 2023, so coming up, through to fiscal year 2027, which is when the uniform block grant amount will go into effect. So there's a built-in transition mechanism so that supervisory unions can adjust and plan for the change in the amount of money they will be receiving based on this new way to calculate special education funding. So what section 1 does is it just amends the way to calculate the first year of census grant funding, so fiscal year 2023. It does not touch census grant funding in general, as far as once that transition period's gone and we get to 2027, this amendment doesn't touch that. It just touches how the first year of census grant funding is calculated. And census grant funding is the first for fiscal year 2023. the supervisory union will receive the average amount it received for fiscal years 2018, 2019, and 2020. And if you ignore the underlined language, which is new, it will, without any amendments, the amount for fiscal year 2023 will be the average of those 3 years, increased by an inflator, and that's little I2, and there's no changes there. What this amendment does is it gives supervisory unions the choice between taking the average amount the supervisory union received for special education funding, and lines 15 through 18, or 17 really, are the specific categories of block grants in current law that the calculations come from. But I'm just going to use the term special education funding rather than go through each specific category. So this amendment gives supervisory unions the choice between using the average of 2018, 2019, and 2020, or the average of fiscal years 2019, 2020, and 21, whichever amount is greater, to calculate their first year in fiscal 2023 of census grant funding.
So again, this is really a transition mechanism.
Yes, and this is only the first year of the transition mechanism. Years 2, 3, and 4 actually use the amount that's calculated for year 1, as it gets factored into this prorated grant for, so it'll be a little bit more in 2024 and a little bit more in 2025 and a little bit more in 2026, with the goal of getting to 2027 with the uniform base amount that a supervisory union would expect to receive going forward. So this is an amendment to the first year of that transition, but that first year amount is used to calculate the amount that supervisory unions will receive in years 2, 3, and 4, not 5 and then going forward, only for those 4 transition years.
Any questions? Yeah.
And then after that, it'll be the same amount, or is there like a inflation escalator?
Yes. So I didn't. This is complicated. The uniform base amount for, I'm just looking at my cheat sheet here. The uniform base amount calculation is in statute, and there's an inflator involved, and there's different fiscal years involved, but it doesn't have anything to do with the transition years.
Right. Okay.
Ms. St. James put together a great one-pager on this. She and I are reviewing, and then we'll share broadly. It'll also be something Senator Terenzini can use on the floor. I do believe this will have to go to finance, given that these kinds of things would impact the revenues of the state. I know it's been a lot of time in Ways and Means on the House side, but I've asked Mr. Bloomer, and we'll hear back from him. Senator Hooker?
Just a clarification on what happens after the first year of the transition, second, third, and fourth years. Again, I'm sorry.
Sure. So for year 1, it's just this average amount multiplied by an inflator. And then for years 2, 3, and 4, you actually take the base amount. This is, so when I, just to help you understand, when I tried to wrap my head around this, I had to write out little equations, and that's what made sense to me. Speaking it and putting it into prose is kind of garbled. So if you're kind of a visual person like me and you want to see my kind of equations, I'm happy to send them to you. But for fiscal years 2, 3, and 4, you take the supervisory union's long-term membership, so that's the average daily membership over a certain, I believe that this statute actually defines long-term membership as the average of 3 years, not 2, multiplied by a prorated base amount. And the base amount is the fiscal year 2023 amount. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ms. St. James, would you mind if I share your consensus grant summary
Sure.
with the committee?
Sure.
That'd be great. Okay. I'm gonna send it. I don't know if Daphne has it. I'll
I
send
did
it to
not.
Daphne
I
right-
did not send it.
Okay, I'll send it to Daphne right now and she can email it along. There's no need to post it. But any questions on that section? Okay, the Holocaust language.
So we're going to pull section 2. So section 3 will be your new. Oh, I'm sorry.
For Senator Chittenden, in section 2, we'll go on to H101. Now then, section 3.
Will be your new section 2, and that is Holocaust Education Report and Recommendations. This language is taken directly from the bill introduced by Senator Terenzini regarding Holocaust language or Holocaust education, and it reads, on or before January 15th, 2023, the Agency of Education shall issue a written report to the Senate and House Committees on Education on the status of Holocaust education in public schools and its recommendations to ensure that Holocaust education is included in the educational programs provided to the students in public schools. In preparing the report and recommendations, the Agency of Education shall work with the Vermont Holocaust Memorial to avail themselves of that organization's knowledge of the subject and experience in Vermont schools.
Okay, Senator Terenzini, that works for you? Good. Okay, great. Good work. We've gone over the powers, duties, and liabilities for bonds, but you just want to just tell us briefly, remind us.
Sure.
You need to read it word for word.
Sure. This is an update to the bonding requirement for a collector and treasurer in an incorporated school district. Current law requires a personal bond for those positions, and that bond is a liability if they, under the duties of their job, if they commit some act that would put them or the school district liable. They are currently under law required to give a personal bond. And this language updates that current language to say that they can do the personal bond, but really what's happening is that school districts are providing crime insurance coverage. And so this language just gives school districts the ability to do that in lieu of requiring a personal bond.
And my only follow-up on this is Sue Siglowski reached out to the Agency of Education. They had a good conversation, and that Secretary French supports the language. And then the final section is the work that we've done on the teacher shortage. And you did make one edit at the recommendation, I believe, of the NEA. Do you want to just tell us about that?
Sure. It's on page 4, lines 11 and 12. It's subdivision B3. So the Vermont NEA suggested that instead of limiting the eligible participants in the grant program to an organization with an established program, that the grant program also be open to school districts, and then they recommended taking out the word established in front of program. So the change in language is just an addition of school districts and then a deletion of the word established, so that potentially there's a program that's not yet created. It doesn't have to be an established program.
Any objections to that? And this language will either stay in this bill, may travel in the yield bill. We may find that it travels in H703, the economic development bill. Senator,
I don't think it matters, but I don't see the removed established in the version in front of me.
Oh,
Which one? Which line?
No, I said.
I see the or school districts, but I don't see removed established.
well, I will look into that. Let me pull up the version that's on your website.
I'm using a printed copy. I don't know if
Where's the removed? Where is it?
she
Established
said in
in
this section,
before
she removed the word
school.
established, but maybe it's in
Do you
the,
see the removed
I don't,
word? You just don't see that.
I don't see a removal or the word.
Oh, so this is all new language. So there wouldn't be a strike through. It just doesn't, the word just doesn't live there anymore.
Yeah. Where was the word?
It was in front of the word programs on line 12.
With
With a staff.
Oh, okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We are going to put this on for at least if finance needs to see it, I'm going to try to move it tomorrow. That gives them plenty of time. They don't need to see it, maybe move it Friday, still could probably move it tomorrow. That still gives us plenty of time. Okay. Great, close to done. Great. Ms. St. James, thanks a million.
Sure, my pleasure.
Okay, turning to our next witness, Ms. St. James. Welcome back to the committee. We are now moving toward H727. And a couple of things on this, as I've mentioned, for those following, probably has to leave us by a week from today. And will be one of the final things we work on. I think we're getting in, I think we're in a good spot with SCO, we're in a good spot with chunk one. And so we're working on some other issues related to the other towns and districts we've talked about. I wonder if it makes the most sense to start with Mr. Olson on this. And he's being admitted now, thank you. And Daphne did send along the one page explainer to everyone on 716. If you would print me up one copy of that, that would be great. Mr. Olson, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Great, thanks. How are you?
Good.
Let's see. We are talking, you sent us, you have to excuse us, we have been on the floor and we have been in morning committees. Usually we get a little bit of a break between things to catch up on email, but that has not been the case today. But I do see an email, or is it 2 emails from you regarding this topic?
Yes, so for the record, Oliver Olson, Chair of the State Board of Education. So I did send to the committee, and I see it's posted on the website as well. There are 3 pieces of correspondence. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. There are 3 pieces of correspondence from supervisory unions in response to a request from the Ripton School District last year. And I don't expect you to read through them. You can skim through them, but I wanted to give you a sense for the challenge that the state board has been faced with some of these withdrawals. And those 3 pieces of correspondence give you a sense of the concerns, the challenges that supervisory unions have raised with us when faced with the prospect of having to accept a school district that has become orphaned because of its own withdrawal action. So again, it just gives you a flavor of kind of what's out there on the ground and some of the difficult choices that we've had to make as a board with current statutory guidance. So on the issue, just returning to yesterday, one of the things I thought was really interesting that came out of the conversation, I believe it was Senator Lyons, raised the point that the most challenging withdrawals that we're dealing with really have originated out of a fear that local elementary schools might be closed by the current district, and that has precipitated some of this withdrawal activity, and that as a result of that, we have folks who are going down a really complicated withdrawal process with significant local, regional, and to some extent even statewide impacts that are of an order of magnitude greater than the issue that they're trying to solve for, namely concern about the future of their elementary school. So we as a board, coincidentally, the state board met earlier today. We had a good discussion about some of these very issues, and the board feels very strongly that we really would want the legislature to consider acknowledging that there are these concerns about school closure that are driving this withdrawal activity. And we need to separate these issues. There are concerns and fears around school closure, but they're getting commingled, no pun intended, Senator Chittenden, they're getting commingled in with governance issues, and we need to find a path to keep those issues separate. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Do you think,
please.
you have a path, or you're just hoping we find
I'm hoping you guys have all the answers.
one? We'll figure it out.
So I think there are a lot of complicated issues, and in fact, we had a meeting earlier today with Lincoln about their proposed withdrawal, and as we started discussing kind of the roadmap forward, with what they're proposing, we continue to uncover other problems, right? So one of the most recent problems that we uncovered just this morning is the transition of these districts, right? So, if we create a new district, what taxing authority does that new district have in the interim period, in that transitionary period where they have to essentially go out and hire new staff and superintendents and business office people? Where do they get the money for that if they don't have the taxing authority? So that's just another example. We just keep uncovering more problems. And for that reason, we don't really have a quick and easy answer. And perhaps there is a path forward here to study these two issues separately but concurrently. So one is the issue of governance change, specifically around withdrawal, right? The House bill is pretty solid in terms of cleaning up the statutes around mergers, but we continue to have some questions and concerns out there about the withdrawal process. Perhaps there's an opportunity to put together a study committee that can look at those issues in more detail, solve for all those problems, come back with a fully baked proposal to deal with this once and for all next year. Concurrently, back to Senator Lyon's point yesterday, we have this undercurrent of concern around school closure, and it's a little broader than just school closure, but I think it encompasses just facility issues in general and decisions around whether a school district is going to operate or not operate at certain grades, and those issues are challenging enough and perhaps warrant their own study and in parallel, and then bring these back next year with these things, and I think that might provide a way forward.
Please,
So,
Robert.
yeah, thank you, Mr. Olson. And in the meantime, what do we do with the schools or the districts that are in the process? Are they put on hold?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the board sort of wrestled with that as well. I think we have some districts that are going to have, we have some that are in process that are very straightforward. The Westminster withdrawal, very straightforward. The Stowe withdrawal, once the little issue in the statute is resolved, very straightforward. Lincoln, Ripton, Starksboro, if they choose to go forward, they've not actually held a vote, though. Those involve a lot of complexities. If they can pull it off and make it work, we should let them move forward, but there should be kind of a dipstick check at some point this summer, and somebody needs to make a decision about whether these can move forward or not, based on some reasonable criteria. And just to keep in mind, like, I'll use Ripton as an example. Right now, the current trajectory they're on, that new school district is meant to be operational July 1st of next year. So if you start working back from July 1st, they're going to have a vote to vote on a budget in March of next year. But then to have the budget developed, they have to put that budget together in the winter in time to get it out to press. And then leading up to that, they need a few months to figure out all the details. So now we're sort of, into this typical sort of school budget season in the fall. Keep in mind, this is a district that has no staff, has no taxing authority, as far as I can tell, and no money in the bank. Probably doesn't even have a bank account. So who is actually going to do this work between April and next fall? And if they get to, say, August and realize that that can't happen, what's the fallback position? And that's the thing that keeps me up at night. Is what happens when they get to August and all of a sudden they realize this isn't going to work.
And
Yeah, please.
who would be responsible for, determining where the taxing authority comes from? In a district.
So I would defer to legislative counsel or Donna. I don't know if perhaps you might want to take a crack at that one. This was just an issue that came to my mind this morning during our discussion with Lincoln.
Donna?
Beth, do you want to address it or do you want me to take a stab?
Please, go ahead.
It doesn't matter to me. Whoever the committee wants to hear from is fine.
Donna, go
Whoever
ahead.
has the answer.
There isn't anything in statute that would give anyone a taxing authority for activities that take place during the transitional period. That's something that you would have to grant them. As a practical matter, the taxpayers of the school district, of the Union School District, are already being taxed in order to keep the schools running. So there isn't an obvious choice of where that money would come from. Having it come from the town's budget doesn't make sense, really, because the town is an entirely separate legal entity that doesn't have any authority or responsibility for schools. So there really is a problem, and that is a problem that is something that we've been aware of, that is in the 724 that came over from the House, as well as, during this transitional period, where does money come from to support any kind of activity that needs to occur? And it might be that the school board members don't get paid, but and that's fine with everyone, that they get no stipend, but how do they hire a lawyer, or how do they hire an accountant, or how do they hire the superintendent early on to help them get everything up and running? All of those, that question is just out there.
But Donna, hasn't this happened in other districts?
Withdrawal has happened in other districts. The two places that have gone forward the furthest, are relatively simple situations, because in both cases they were already part of a multi-district supervisory union, and in both cases none of them had really done anything much to become a single unit. They were sort of a single unit in name only, and had been operating pretty separately anyway. So, and since everybody wanted the withdrawal to occur, it all just sort of happened, and it worked out. And it really wasn't until Ripton came along that a lot of these issues started to surface for the state board, because it was really the first time where everyone wasn't just saying, well, we'll make it work, because we all want it to happen.
Right, right.
So,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
the,
Oh, you mind saying real quick, or he just jumps in for a
Well,
second?
just so those schools that were kind of separate, are all the finances separate? You know, each of the schools has its own finances, so that when they withdrew, they could take their money and.
I
back
don't
their
know.
own-
I don't know the details. I just know that in one case, it was a Union Elementary school that had been created by the state board, and it never wanted to be a Union Elementary school. And so they pretty much went on as they always went on. And the other was another school district that had formed voluntarily, but had never embraced the notion that they were a single unit in the same way. So I don't know the details, but I know that because everyone wanted it, and because they'd always thought about themselves as separate, it just wasn't, it never rose to the issue where anyone else had to deal with the issues.
but another key distinguishing factor is to really emphasize is that those two other ones that were relatively straightforward, they were districts that were part of a supervisory union, and when they withdrew or dissolved, they stayed within the same supervisory union structure that they had. So they still had the same superintendent, business manager, special ed, all that stuff, you know, so and the contracts were, you know, held at the same level anyway. So it was, I characterize it as kind of a lift and shift operation. When we get into Ripton, Lincoln, and potentially Starksboro, all three are withdrawing from a supervisory district, and they're now, they will be separate from that, and they have to provide on their own. They have to find a way to provide all of these services that they no longer will be receiving. And namely, it's the administrative services that really are responsible for managing the operations and the educational programs of these schools, you know, hiring the teachers, putting together the school budget, you know, all those things that's, you know, the central office typically does. They're essentially trying to start central office from scratch.
Yeah. So what we have, Donna, do you want to add anything else at this point?
No, that was an excellent point, and no, I have nothing else to add.
So we have draft language from Ledge Council that in some ways, which we can take a look at, which would, I think we're trying to get to, you know, move forward with the language. But as you're saying, Mr. Olson, do we have a check-in? Do we have something along the way that says, okay, folks, you're really not ready to go? So there's sort of that approach, and the other approach is really putting everything on hold until these things are really examined. Well, like you said, two simultaneous sort of studies, one around governance around withdrawals, and the second is school closures as it relates to, you know, facilities, things like that. I mean, that to me seems, and I'm looking for others, the two paths. We're not going to just let it go as I think the House proposes. I think we're gonna definitely make some changes. It's either keep working with the House stuff and put some guardrails in, put some check-ins. The problem with that, I feel, is okay, so what if come August, you know, folks really aren't ready to go? We're not in session. You know, who are we going to hand it off to, and what does that do for kids? Committee. Jennifer?
Is it August of 2022 or August 2023 that?
20, are we talking this August or the following August?
No, this August, because like Ripton, I'm just going to focus on Ripton now to keep it simple. Ripton right now goes live next July of 2023. But as you start working back all the way back to the budgeting process,
Oh, okay.
we need to know like late summer, early fall, whether that's going to work out.
So you're.
And I don't know how it's going to. Yeah, I still can't figure out how it's going to work out if they don't even have any taxing authority to, you know, to hire the people to do the work.
So your concern is they'll get to August, they still have the teachers, they could teach the students, but they might realize, well, we don't have the ability to get to the budget in March for when we're really on our own the following year. But at that point, it might be too late to do anything different. They can still teach the kids. It's not like teachers wouldn't get paid or something.
That's true.
The teachers this year in the 2022-23 school year will still be the employees of the Union School District. So there isn't any question about that. The budget would be for the following year when Ripton is supposed to take over. There are a lot of other problems about, are they able to enter into contracts, you know, with those teachers for the year in which they'd be fully operational. But as far as being paid, they are still employees, and they will be in the coming school year. They will still be employees of the Union School District.
Isn't in the House language, they have a off ramp for the, I remember hearing from Representative Conlon when he was here, I think it was for all three, anybody withdrawing, that Ripton could off ramp in August or at some point, right?
They can off ramp themselves, but that relies on them making that decision.
And you're worried that they might not be able to see in their fervor to have an independent school, they won't see the danger coming and
they may not see it early enough. And then the problem is going to be when they do finally realize, let's just play this out. Let's say they say, oh, August, we're going to make it work. We're going to make it work. And then we get to June 30th of next year.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't have a superintendent. They don't have a budget. Then they're going to say, well, we need help. Who's going to help them? What's plan B? Or worse yet, or, you know, another scenario is they realize that, let's say in January or December, that, you know, as they're trying to put together a budget, that, you know, they haven't hired a superintendent to help put that budget together because they don't actually have a budget to hire the superintendent to do all of that pre-planning, that transition planning. Then they say, okay, well, now we want to pull the ripcord and go back. But the problem is the other district that they just left, they already put their budget out to the voters. So it just turns into a giant mess.
And we heard, I can't remember if it was folks from Lincoln or Starksboro, about the idea that the three towns would join up and create a new union. But it seems like the timeline wouldn't work for that, for the school year start of 2023.
It's a combination of the timeline, but also the lack of any sort of transition provisions and funding, right? Because to pull together, to create it, essentially what we're talking about is creating a new supervisory union. You don't just get to July 1st and have it go live. You need to have a you know, at 6, 9, even 12 months in advance of, you know, a transition structure in place to put together all the planning, put together the initial budget. But how does that get paid for? And how are the taxes raised to support that? You sort of have the sort of duplicate, you know, taxing entities. It becomes a bit, it's doable, but under the current law, unless I've missed something, I don't see structurally how it happens under our current statutory framework.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm worried. I'm worried that as the legislature, we have a situation before us where I'm inclined to think we should step in. I mean, we will continue to work on this, but like you're saying, it's how do we put in some real guardrails, or again, sort of put things on hold. Yeah.
And,
I'm sorry, were you?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
and I, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Olson, did you give these concerns to the House Committee when they were working on the language in that chunk 3 for all these things? Were you involved in that, or things have changed since then?
No, definitely, we express concerns about where the trajectory, but again, every time we engage further with this, because this is all new to the board as well as it's new to everybody, we uncover more problems. And so, thinking through the transition period and how the money is raised and spent to support that, that's sort of more recent thinking based on recent conversations. I do want to point out there is a quote unquote simple solution to this, right? It's not simple, but it is. It could be characterized as a simple solution, and that is you could direct the state board, and I think this is one of the proposals from Herb Olson. You could direct the state board to say, we don't care what the other supervisory unions say. They may not want to absorb these districts, but we want the state board to, force one or more of these supervisory unions to absorb these withdrawing towns. So that is that's a policy question for you. The state board has taken the position that we're not going to do that based on our reading of policy coming out of Act 46 and its successor legislation. And if we did that, you have a sense, and that's why I provided those letters of the blowback that we would all get from those supervisory unions.
Rather than directing you to absorb these towns, instead just giving you the ability to do so that in your adjudication and evaluation of each case that you would have that option? Would that be a middle ground?
We have the option, and we could have done that. And that's why you have those letters that I shared with you, because we did have that conversation. We spent, many hours hearing everybody's arguments, and our conclusion was that it wasn't fair to impose upon these supervisory unions these districts that were withdrawing, right? Essentially these districts or communities are withdrawing. They're voting themselves off the island, but they don't want to take the full responsibility that comes with that independence. And that's a policy decision. We can very easily force them into another supervisory union. But I would caution you that, those letters illustrate the blowback that we would get if we did that.
Where are people leaning?
Well, I don't like the idea, just like I don't really I want the town's ability to decide to withdraw. But in that same venue, I don't want to force other towns to take a school they don't want. So that's why I don't want to force the superintendent to take a town. So like, we don't like the rules, so we're going to withdraw. But then you have to provide us their services, because that puts a burden on those towns that can by now want it. It's a top-down forcing. On the other side, you have to have a supervisory union, so you can't. It kind of takes away the power of a town to withdraw if they can't create it on their own. But it gets back to this question about, does a moratorium on school closures get us? Well, I mean, I assume it gives us more time. I don't know if the key towns that are thinking about withdrawing,
How they would respond?
yeah, is that good for them, or do they feel like it's not? Does it just create more uncertainty for more time? But
Interrupts their processes that they've gone through and votes.
yeah, but maybe it puts it on hold. But yes, it just like it prevents the worst thing from happening that I think they're afraid of. But maybe there are other things, and they were just about to have a vote, and then we say, well, we can't have a vote. Or, I don't. So I'm thinking that might be a helpful idea, that you can't close the schools, but also this withdrawal has to change.
I mean, studying really what's going to happen when they do withdraw. Come up with some
Right, which I think
Some
House,
preparedness, really.
which I think the House did, is saying like, you've got to go to the board with a plan, who's gonna provide these services. I think those make sense, because you don't want a town to withdraw and then find out, well, wow, this is not
Right.
really
And then who's
functional.
educating your kids?
Well, even if the kids get educated, but it's just a mess, everybody's spending
Right.
hours and hours.
If you're a teacher, and there's so much uncertainty as to what the future of the school is gonna be. I would think people are gonna say, hey, maybe I should put an application in somewhere else. I just worry about even that kind of culture. We don't know if this is gonna be going much longer. Sort of a similar theme came up with one of our other bills. I don't know.
I like the idea of a moratorium on school closures, just because this is such a complex issue and there's people stuck in the middle. But I like it because I think it should give these towns some peace of mind to have more time considered before actions are taken.
But would you accompany that with a moratorium on withdrawals?
I'm not opposed to that.
I might ask for a dipstick check earlier, because I don't want to think that the towns aren't going to do their very best. And, it sounds as if you're thinking that they'll just go along and wait until whenever, and then suddenly realize that, oh, well, we haven't done enough. But it seems to me that the towns that want to withdraw are working really hard at it. And if there's a time that we can set for them to come back with the plan, but then it gets back into what's in the bill already as far as the plan goes. Maybe if it isn't as
Yeah, the question is, those ones that started, I think we seem to be in agreement on the withdrawal for somebody that might start the full process next year.
right.
Maybe some tweaks like the 60% or something, but
Yeah, sure.
it's really
Once
these
they
towns
start.
that are, these two towns that have already started. Do we make them go do more planning before they proceed?
I'm still hung up on where they're gonna get the money.
But that seems like to be a pretty major.
Yeah, huge.
Who's gonna do all the work? They don't have their own, they have a small volunteer school board, but they don't have the access to the staff of the supervisory union if they fall out of the freedom withdrawal.
And then what was it, North Bennington that withdrew and became an independent school?
Right, that which,
What they did, well, Donna, correct me if I'm wrong, North Bennington they withdrew, closed and became an independent school prior to Act 46.
They did, but they didn't withdraw from anything. They closed their elementary school and began tuitioning.
In that supervisory union.
Exactly. But it was prior to Act 46, but withdrawal wasn't involved.
And so do they, as an independent school, have to provide special ed?
Yeah, the LEA does that they're a part of, which is the.
The SU,
supervisory-
yeah.
The SU.
so if they're not
And-
sending any, they don't have a school, then whatever school they send their kids
Send
is
the kids
responsible
to.
for that.
Good point. So it became a sending district. So yes, you can use the village school, which is now the independent school. But Senator Persick's point, you could go to Highland Hall School, which is in Shaftesbury, go down to Williamstown to a school. And I don't know the status of special education in those schools.
So I would
Yeah.
suggest just on the school closure moratorium, because that's a complex topic. I would definitely recommend hearing from the Secretary French for his thoughts on this,
Okay.
because it ties in with a broader kind of question around facilities in general. I would suggest, and school closure means different things to different people, right? So is school
Yeah.
closure, you put a padlock on the door and call it a day? Is school closure if you stop operating half or a few of the grades? different people interpret it different ways. But if you are thinking about some sort of a moratorium with some further study on the issue of school closure, you might want to target it, be very surgical about having it apply to this specific region, the districts that we're talking about, to provide a little bit of breathing room to look at the broader issues, to, both with respect to school closure standards, if you guys are interested in standards around that, and also maybe fleshing out some of the details on these withdrawals as
Right.
part of a study.
Okay, so I think in conclusion, what we're going to ask of you, Ms. St. James, is to prepare for the committee 2 documents. One is what Chair Olson just referenced, which would be indeed, the moratorium, the 2 studies, one around, withdrawing, and then the other on school closures, and then the moratorium also around school closures. So I feel like that's one, and I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind, don't put it into 727. Let's just look at the language on its own. The second document is the more of the check-in, the dipstick, a little bit more of the, hey, this is where we're at. And then if certain things haven't been met, I mean, you're hearing a little bit of this, but we can pull this apart with you after we see some draft language. Well, then somebody's going to have to take over. Somebody's going to have to be, this isn't the right word, the expression, but the adult in the room. And people can't figure this out. I'm just worried that we're setting kids up and school districts up and teachers up for a lot of uncertainty. And so those are kind of the 2 paths. Am I misrepresenting? Okay.
You actually have, I'm sorry.
I know we have some of that language already. I'm wondering though if, and I'm sorry to ask this because it's a bit of a pain, I get it. Can you just yank it out? Is that possible to yank it out of the of 727 itself and just have us look at it, kind of 2 things separately?
Yes, so what I prepared for you today is that should be posted on your website is just chunk 3, just chunk 3, which is the session law, which is the sections about withdrawals underway. With the language proposed by the State Board of Education for those check-ins, and then basically what the language does for certain situations is say, if you can't meet this criteria, we automatically reverse your withdrawal, you go back to square one.
Got it. So we've got that. So the only thing that we would need from you then is that first piece. And I would say, if you don't mind, then we'll pick this up tomorrow. Anybody need anything else from Ms. St. James? And then we'll kind of clear the way a little bit and look at both of these tomorrow. Donna, Oliver, how does that sound to you? May
I ask for clarity on the first option? You were talking about then a moratorium on school closures, you said, and that would only be for in those 3 areas, or that would be statewide?
Good question.
And then, I'm sorry, and then there's a second question too, but okay. And the second question is I wasn't certain if you meant that there would be a moratorium on withdrawals also, or if you were thinking that you would amend the statutory language from the House.
So the first question around a moratorium on school closures, I'm thinking statewide. That way people are, and I'm looking to the committee, I mean, that's where there's still a lot of anxiety out there. As Senator Lyons mentioned yesterday, that's one of the issues that's happening. So I think we put a moratorium on it statewide.
It could be unless the town votes, without a town vote, because the town wants to close it.
And they could.
That's a good point. Yes. If the town wants to do it, that's one thing. That would, because that's not really causing the anxiety. It's someone else sort of coming in and closing without some kind of, process.
If I could, I just want to make sure, I think you were talking about a statewide moratorium on the withdrawals, but a targeted moratorium on closures. Did I hear that wrong?
That's what you said.
Yeah.
That's what you said, and we were thinking the closure
Okay.
piece, there's so much anxiety out there statewide that, maybe we do it statewide.
With the exception that the town can vote.
Save except when a town decides to do it. And then with the withdrawals, I was thinking that might be more targeted, but maybe we do that statewide. Birch? Yeah.
Well, the new rules will help that.
Birch,
Like the chunk 1, chunk 2, that will give them those guidelines. For the withdrawals.
Except that there are others that are potentially coming forward that that the state board doesn't have a good statute to operate under.
Well, that's the argument to not do that. So I think the House language is fine on that for going forward with those tweaks that we've talked about here or there.
50%, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and my understanding is the Board of Education, Mr. Olson can correct me if I'm wrong, supports that language.
We're supportive. We remain concerned, and I would encourage you to consider the policy question around the current House passed language has the state board providing an advisory opinion. And the board remains concerned that there's nobody at the statewide level that can say, yeah, this is not a good idea. This has broader regional and or statewide impacts and should not move forward. And under what passed the House, nobody has that authority. And the board is agnostic about who should have that authority, but we do feel pretty strongly that someone at the state level, whether it's the legislature, the AOE, the state board, or some other entity, should be charged with looking at the regional and statewide impacts, and if necessary, prevent one of these withdrawals from going forward. Because as we've learned through these recent experiences, there's a lot of emotion in the room, oftentimes driven by other issues unrelated to governance that are, causing a lot of other problems.
And maybe you, Oliver, or Donna knows, if the school got to the point where they were not able, in the state's eyes, not able to meet the needs of the education of the students, can't the state basically withhold the funds for them to operate the school? There is no other way. And I know it's something that we talked about a couple of years ago about facilities, that other states certify school facilities and they can basically red tag a school and say, you can't have students in this building. We don't have that in Vermont, I know, but I don't know if there's any other, whether they're withdrawing or not, does the state, since it's the constitutional responsibility of the state have a ability to basically withhold the funds?
Yes, there's a statute that's been in law for as long as I know, that says that if a school district doesn't do anything, doesn't follow any law that is in place, the state has the ability to withhold funds. I don't believe it's ever been used because all that does is hurt the students. And so I don't think that it's been something that the state has been willing to do.
Ms. St. James?
In the Educational Quality Standards Statute, there is a whole section related to what happens if a school fails to meet the standards. And there's multiple options in current state law for what could happen, including an adjustment of SU boundaries, the secretary assuming administrative control over a school, the state board closing an individual school, or the state board requiring consolidation. I don't know to what extent any of those mechanisms have ever been used, but there are mechanisms under the Educational Quality Standards Statute that do contemplate what happens if a school is failing.
I was going to mention that as well. To the best of my knowledge, those statutes have not been used. So the board is aware of those statutes. The problem again is the concern that the board has is that why create a problem that we then have to address on the back end? It just, if we see a problem coming, why wouldn't we take action then? Otherwise, we're just creating a lot of chaos in a system that's already under a lot of stress right now.
St. James, is our request of you pretty clear?
Can I repeat it back to you?
Absolutely.
So you're looking for a moratorium, a statewide moratorium on school closures, correct? Okay. Do you have any guardrails or boundaries on what you would consider a school closure, or would you like me to contemplate all iterations of school closure?
Would appreciate if you consider that.
Okay. And then 2 studies. One, I'm sorry.
Just to get us started with some language.
And then 2 studies, one on school closures and one on the withdrawal process. Is that it?
I think that's it.
Okay.
And then we already have your other language, which you'll pull out, and we'll take a look tomorrow. We'll have Daphne schedule you back in to do sort of that side by side. Great. Thank you all.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take just 5 minutes. We're gonna probably go into 5, stay until 5:30.
Sure.
Okay.